want to welcome you to this forum on craftsmanship in the 21st century, in which we're going to explore the nature and the state of craftsmanship, particularly in southern Vermont, where we are. What are the challenges, what are the opportunities that craftsmen face, and that the state of handcrafts faces in our country and in our communities. This forum is part of American Craft Week, which is a national celebration of crafts, and it's being presented by Brattleboro West Arts and the Brooks Library. I'd like to recognize Chris Chapman, who is one of the select board members here in Brattleboro, and I think he has something to share with us.
Thank you, Doug. As my name is Chris Chapman. I'm with the select board as vice chair this year. And a former select board member, Greg Worden, asked me to recite the proclamation that was made September 20th in recognition of the American Craft Month. And he asked that I read this to you, which I'm happy to do. Being a proclamation that has a lot of whereas paragraphs, so bear with me, but they're all for the cause. But before I start, I wanted to say how wonderful it is that the Putney School students are here. And I'm speaking personally at this point rather than for the board itself, but I've been terrifically impressed and awed by the works displayed at Vermont Artisans that were contributed for display by the Putney School students and others as well. Astonishing creativity and lovely and exciting. And I'd like to just recognize those folks from Putney in the program that they have. Wouldn't it be great if every school was able to have the coaching and counseling of young artists the way Putney School does? This is not to diminish what's going on in Brattleboro, which has a very strong arts community, but I really appreciate the leadership in the arts world there. So let me read this proclamation in honor of American Craft Month. Whereas the town of Brattleboro believes in the enduring value of handmade craft and celebrates the artists and craftspeople who make them, and whereas settlers came to Vermont in the early 18th century bringing their skills of furniture making, pottery, weaving, metalsmithing, and glass blowing, the state and people of Vermont have a centuries-old tradition of these crafts, and whereas these crafts help build the economic base of our state and towns and still contribute to its reputation and success. And whereas the town of Brattleboro acknowledges its appreciation to all the craftspeople who have contributed and continue to contribute to the rich culture of our state. And whereas the town of Brattleboro embraces and celebrates the creativity of our citizens. And whereas Brattleboro West Arts offers its third annual studio tour on September 24th and 25th of this year. And whereas the Vermont Crafts Council, in cooperation with the state of Vermont, is offering the inaugural Fall Open Studio Weekend on October 1st and 2nd of 2011, and expects that craftspeople throughout our state will be displaying their workmanship throughout the month at numerous fairs and events. And whereas many of the craftspeople and galleries in Brattleboro will be celebrating the second annual American Craft Week on October 7th through the 16th, 2011, with special activities encouraging visitors to come to Vermont for the foliage season. And whereas all of the craftspeople and galleries wish to let visitors know that despite past fires and recent floods, they can still get here from there. Now, therefore, we, the Select Board of the Town of Brattleboro, do hereby proclaim October 2011 as American Craft Month in Vermont and urge all citizens to commend its observance. This proclamation was dated September 20th, 2011.
I'm Doug Cox. I'm a violin maker, live in West Brattleboro, and I'm going to serve as the moderator for this panel. We have four craftsmen, craftsfolk from Brattleboro West Arts. That's the organization that I am the coordinator for. And we'll have some introductions of who these people are and what they do and their thoughts on issues before us. And then I will focus some questions that arise during this initial part, and then we'll be opening it up for questions from all of you, comments. This is meant to be an open community forum, started with a panel, not just a panel presentation. The forum today is co-sponsored by the Brooks Library. Therefore, I think we have to include a book. And this book, The Craftsman, by Richard Sennett, has been important in my life. It's about a year old, and it's caused me to do a good deal of thinking about craftsmanship. I will likely be raising some questions or some points that Richard Sennett would raise if he were here on his behalf. He is a sociologist and as a young person trained as a pianist and is very interested in the whole question of craftsmanship in Western society, its history, its current state, and its role in the future. So therefore comes the question of whither craftsmanship in the 21st century. One of the points that Richard Sennett makes, he talks about craftsmanship as being an intelligence that arises not from the head but from the hand. It's the craftsman's hand through the tools, engaging with materials, brings an intelligence and an understanding of our place in the world that's different from an intellectual approach to understanding the world. And this is part of what he values. So what we're going to do to start this off is we have 8 very talented and experienced hands here in the front. So we're going to get into the topic of craftsmanship not from the intellectual side, but from the hands-on side. Who would like to start first?
My name is Walter Slowinski, and I've been doing pottery for 40 years in one way or another. Basically, I started when I was in high school, and when I went to college at Oberlin College, they had a wood-fired kiln there. They had actually no courses in pottery, but there was a student collective, a student co-op that was an opportunity for people to learn it, and someone in the cooperative had made a wood kiln in previous years. So I was introduced to wood firing at that time and became quite interested in it, and that has been an enduring interest for me. I continue to do pottery really as an avocation, with breaks but some consistency, until I moved to Brattleboro about 13 years ago. And a couple of years after I moved here, I was able to make my own wood kiln, which I've fired a dozen times or so, and am really glad to be part of the Brattleboro West Arts Group. And just recently, that's taken a big step forward for me. My other work, besides with pottery, was a medical physician, and I left that work about a year ago. I worked in Putney for about 10 years as a physician and decided to step back from that. And the vacuum was filled, or I moved into doing much more with my art. And more or less coincident with that, Brattleboro West Arts started to kind of come into its own. So I was really delighted to be able to be welcomed into that group, and that's been a really helpful focus for me. I'm intrigued by the notion of what is craftsmanship in the 21st century, what's the state of it, and particularly related to my work, which is based on a Japanese tradition that is probably 2,000 years old. And more or less the firing technique and the manufacture, the crafting of these pots hasn't really changed too much. You know, the techniques haven't changed enormously in that period of time. So the question kind of comes up: well, what's new? What's really going on? And for me, also, that was kind of coincident with my sort of embracing this craft in a more full way. So, in answering that question, there's a lot of sort of, just personally for me, what have been the challenges, what's been going on in the last few years. And so answering this, from a personal, but also in conversation with other people, I have really kind of two themes, or two things came up for me. One is computers, and the other is what I would call localism. And I just was impressed, in a sense, immediately coming into the art group, how much digital technology was really important to our work. Just in very basic ways of communicating with each other, going to other meetings, and just the way that people correspond these days. Interestingly for me, was not so much part of my medical work, very technical field, but actually the way that my career had progressed, I didn't really have too much to do with computers. And getting more into art actually kind of compelled me to become more familiar with the digital technology. And in a wide variety of ways. It doesn't specifically relate to the manufacture or the making of my stuff, but how I communicate with fellow artists, how I think about promoting my stuff, how I think of documenting it, marketing it, and those kinds of things. So it's really been key, and my sense is for other people in the group, we come at this technology from very different perspectives. Some are completely comfortable with the digital world, or at least much more comfortable than me, and others are really not interested at all, and don't have email, and just don't want to be contacted that way. So I'm comfortably kind of in the middle of this group, in a sense, or at least not at one extreme or another. And for me, it's been interesting. It's been fun to just sort of get familiar with what people are thinking about with this. And a couple of examples of that include video technology. A friend of mine, cousin of mine, also interested in pottery, is a videographer, and visited me during a firing and shot some film there. And subsequently, I had that edited and put up on YouTube, which really serves no great purpose. There was no real function to this, but it kind of exemplifies a fascination, I think, that we all have with this technology and the possibilities, and just a kind of interest in using it and getting familiar with it, and to seeing what the limits are. There's been conversation within this group and others in this community about how do we use social media as a marketing technique and sort of connecting to the wider community of people that might be really interested in our stuff. And some people have really taken that great lengths, and it's kind of looking at this digital technology, the digital world, as to how can it work in this new way. I mean, the social media were not really developed specifically with the idea of helping artists market their work, but it actually turns out to be a pretty good tool for that, for people if they want to use it in that way. I've also become more familiar with digital photography and just plain little Photoshop stuff, and you start thinking about animation and blah, 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 which really doesn't have anything to do with ceramics, but inevitably, I kind of feel like as an artist, we get drawn into this as soon as we start thinking about marketing our stuff or communicating with each other. The second theme that occurs to me as being relevant in the 21st century and sort of like what's going on here is this notion of localism. In that we celebrate kind of who we are as a community, and the basis of the group, Brattleboro West Arts, is really geographic, very limited geographic entity, the Whetstone Brook. We all live within the watershed of that. And a lot of us in the group, including myself, are interested in using local materials. For me, I use found wooden handles. I just basically search the woods for some branch that looks like it might be an interesting handle. And also, by my process of wood firing, I'm actually using wood that's grown around here as the fuel. It ends up on the surface of the pot and really as a decorative element. And the ability to be able to fire with wood is not available to people in an urban environment because there's not so much wood and there's more neighbors that would complain about the smoke and so on. So it's really, it's a process that can happen locally. And interestingly, in a very small local area here, there's a relatively high number of wood-fired potters. Within a radius of about 10 miles, there's approximately 6 of us, which is a very high concentration. And you know, we do really celebrate ourselves, or celebrate the local environment. And that seems to be the, you know, the other main thing I've noticed and been delighted about.
Thank you, Walter. Who'd like to go next?
Well, I can feed off of the local part, I suppose. I wrote mine down because I do have a tendency to wander.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. My name is Marta Birnbaum. I'm a glass blower. My husband and I met in college blowing glass, and we now have a studio in West Brattleboro. And so I had to write a bit out because I could go for days on any one subject. But being an artist and having a background in retail, I've done a lot to try to educate buyers about what it is that they're buying. And oftentimes I would get people turning their faces up at a $25 glass or mug or something because the price is not what they see in their box stores down the street. And I wonder, you know, do they know about how these things are made? And that question, you know, comes up to me. It came up to me in college when I saw a movie titled Glass India, and it showed a glass factory where the men were working practically barefoot and throwing glass to each other from across the room in order to make a piece that much quicker, so that they could sell a dozen for $16. So, you know, we you know, are these choices we want to make? Do we want to expose these people to this kind of hardship in order to have a cheap glassware in our houses? You know, the truth is that we no longer know when we're getting a deal. We're so used to the cheap foreign products that we don't even know what it would cost really to make a T-shirt, what it would cost to make a plate, what it would cost to make a rug. You know, and then you don't even include the markup or shipping or any of the other things that come with retail. You know, and do these items leave us with a warm feeling in our hearts? You know, when you see these manufactured products, do you feel anything? And over the past 10 years, my husband and I have stripped everything out of our cabinets and have started to acquire handmade objects. So our coffee mugs are made by Naomi and by Tita and by Matt Tell and hopefully soon Walter. I'm working up to that one. You know, and so and every day that we get our morning cup of coffee or something out of our cabinets, we see these objects made by our friends and our neighbors, and it makes us warm and fuzzy and feel good, which you can't say that about the mug that says world's best dad, no matter how nice that is. You know, it just doesn't cut it. So I really have wandered off of this thing. You know, and then you wonder, like 100 years ago, you know, people were using handmade things every day, and they wouldn't have thought it was a novelty to be using a mug made by your neighbor. And yet now it's a novelty. And, you know, we have friends and family come and visit us, and they're blown away by our collection, which is, you know, it's just our neighbors. You know, and that to me is remarkable. And the design and the feel of these pieces is unparalleled, and oftentimes there's components that no factory could ever possibly produce because they need to take shortcuts in order to make the things quicker. And so you don't get those special nuances that make them really, really unique. And, and we do live within a budget. We don't have a lot of expendable money to go around, but we do things with barter. We do things from trade. We attend the Empty Bowls dinner every year. Can't miss that one. And, we're not going out and refilling our cabinets all at once. It's 1 mug a year. And over 10 years, that's 10 mugs. It's very doable if, that is your goal. And, we don't have carpet on our floors yet, but we have a cabinet full of craft, and that to us is where it feels important. And then I said, oh my goodness, what does this work have to do with my creative process? Well, a lot. My work is about living with intention and line with intention, and I will make a bead and I will do Japanese calligraphy on it with intention, with each stroke and each little brush movement, and so to be in my community with intention is really, really significant. And we buy local food, crafts, and services, and it makes the Brattleboro economy hum, and it keeps that money off of Wall Street. Couldn't get any better. We have a great arts community surrounding us, and we cherish this place and embrace the fact that we live with craft. And it makes it really special that that's available here in this area. That's fine.
Thank you, Marta. So you want to help with that carpeting?
Yes, there.
My name is Chris McDermott. I live in Dummerston. And then I'm a very active part of Brattleboro West Arts. And we're on the West Brattleboro side of Dummerston, a little corner. I worked in Brattleboro for the visiting nurse for about 22 years as an occupational therapist. And it's interesting that in OT school, back when I went to school in the 70s, or late 60s, early 70s, we had to take craft classes because it was felt at the time that for rehabilitation, and it was primarily veterans then, but it's everyone, that crafts was a way to really have our patients participate in not only increasing range of motion, lifting your arm up like this, but also learning a skill. Now, OT, the field changed soon after that, and it became much more functional, which really I supported. But even back in school, I had to take weaving and woodworking, and I made a letter opener out of plexiglass, and so I had this relationship with craft a long time ago, like Walter was saying, like all of us. And I got out of school and kind of, I think, like a lot of women, tried quilting and knitting and needlepoint and a variety of different crafts, and then saw an ad, learn how to braid a rug. I didn't know what a braided rug was, but I took this class mainly to meet people, and I was new in this community, and my rug braiding teacher talked me into taking rug hooking and made a little mention of, combining the two. And so I fell in love with it instantly, and was lucky enough to learn how to do both at the same time in the late 70s. So just for your information, this is rug braiding. If you have braided hair before, though this is more difficult, but it's the same. There are 3 strands, and it's a typical braiding motion. Braided rugs can be in any, made out of any materials. It's interesting, in the early 1800s, women were using what they had, scraps of fabric around their homes, because they needed the warmth on the floor. And rug braiding became, really something, again, very functional that people did to be able to stay in Vermont winters and, other places where it was freezing. Hooking, somewhat similar background, around the same time, early 1800s. But people, and there's evidence that women, and it primarily is women, and still today, but we're really experimenting with color. And so even though it was functional, there were designs in hooked rugs. And so hooking, this is hooking. So you can make a picture out of a hooked rug. And we have some pretty early rugs that where there is a really strong design element, and they were useful. As the world became more industrialized, then people were manufacturing braided rugs, and so this was country, this was craft. It was people who didn't have a lot of money did this, and it was really frowned upon, unfortunately. And then in the 1900s, as again people had more leisure time, it became more popular. And now, in my world of rug hooking and rug braiding, especially rug hooking, it's amazing. It's all over the country. There are guilds. So you can do it alone, or you can do it with a group of people. So every other week, I go to a rug social at the Chesterfield Inn, where we have. I did retire a year and a half ago, and because this part of my life was getting I was getting busier. And yet I can go up to my sewing room. I'm a really early riser, and I love the 4 to 8 o'clock in the morning. It's my time, and I can just be creative and work on a variety of things. And so I'm in love with it. I love to feel wool. I use wool and silk. Another member of Brattleboro West Arts, Karen Kamenetsky, got me excited about silk, and so now we dye all our fabric together, and because they're animal-based products, and we just love it. Love to touch it and fold it, and fold it for braid, hook it in rugs, and then my thing is I combine the two of them. They are primarily pieces for the wall, though you certainly could walk on them. Not this, but just to kind of show you again, there is evidence that these two crafts were combined. The shakers are probably best known. They would hook a rug, which is this part, and then they would put one row of braid on the outside just for a frame to protect the hooking when you walked on it. And there are some incredible shaker rugs still at the various shaker museums around the country and at the Shaker Library in New York. So it's not that it wasn't done in the past, but it was kind of forgotten. And rug braiding, again, was kind of out of favor, but somehow it just stuck with me, and I just fell in love with it. And so I found for myself that selling a piece, they take a very long time to do. And like an oriental rug or oriental carpet that people pay many thousands of dollars for, the finely knotted ones, so it is with rug hooking and rug braiding, and there just isn't a big market for me in that area. But what has happened is teaching, and that's kind of the route I've gone. Because I do something that not many people do. I have a number of jobs. In fact, a great student, Carol Schnabel, is right here, and she brought a braided bag that she made. Carol, would you hold it up? Because it's really, you can see how different we all are, and they're all, they're also just fascinating. That's a braided bag with braided handles and really interesting fabric. Being part of a guild is a great way for a craft person to be involved with the outside world, and yet you can do it by yourself. Being part of Brattleboro West Arts, where there's a variety of artists, and I think communicating, via the computer really has made this a different business. Having a website, getting your name out there, and then to say nothing of all the emails that go back and forth between our members. But it's more than that. It's getting together, listening to other people's stories in our group, sharing your story. If you have a question, there are crit groups where you meet with other members, and I know Doug's going to be going into that more, but getting some advice on if you're stuck, and I think that's really valuable for we craft people. So I guess later we'll talk more about the supplies. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Michael, I think we don't have any choice but to...
Michael Weitzner. I'm a dry stone waller. Some people would call me a mason or a dry stone mason or a dry laid mason. I use the term dry stone waller because that's the terminology used in Britain, where I formally learned what I started to learn at age 5 at the knee of my grandfather, who was a craftsman in his own right. He was actually a gunsmith, but also a landscaper, and built walls. So he introduced me to that, and rather like Walter, it was an avocation for me, and I messed around with it for a few years, off and on, until I decided that I didn't want to be in academia. By that time I was approaching 30, and perhaps just beyond it. And I decided I would try something else, and something else turned out to be dry stone walling, which I had done for almost 20 years professionally. I have worked my way up through the Dry Stone Walling Association of Great Britain's Craftsman Certification Scheme, as it's called. There are 4 levels to that, and the highest level is Master Craftsman. So I actually have a piece of paper that says that I am a Master Craftsman per their certification process, and that now I have the privilege of being an examiner for other people who wish to take certification tests of that type for the Dry Stone Walling Association of Great Britain. Now, I mention Great Britain here a lot. Why? It's where I came from to come to Vermont. I lived there for 15 years. I lived here for 16 years. And along with other people in the trade or craft, and that's an interesting little discussion right there. What is trade? What is craft? How different are they? Are they separate? Are they not? Been trying to improve the quality of walling in general in our area and in the U.S. as a whole, in North America as a whole, by promoting awareness of the fact that there are different ways to build walls, just as there are different ways to braid rugs, or to make pots, or to be a doctor, or make violins. And by different ways, I mean different approaches, different methods, different levels of skill and training. One can acquire skill without training, and then it can be questionable whether that skill is appropriate to the end product. So training, to me, is part of craftsmanship in the true sense. If one is to develop a craft, training is key. One has to learn it, not just by doing it, but by seeing someone else do it and having other people's input who are also craftspeople. And hence the Craftsman Certification Scheme came to be in Britain for dry stone wallers. There are many similar training and certification schemes in history that no longer exist or may resume their existence as we become more aware that there is this need for training and an understanding of what is a certain standard achieved. As Marta was saying, we can train anybody very quickly who has the modicum of ability to throw some material into a machine, press a button, and out comes a manufactured object. You can set up somebody as a technician with a bunch of stuff to make rugs with a machine, and they are, in a sense, craftspeople. But they are not doing artisanal craft work in the true sense of the word, where personality comes through, where training comes through, where a tradition in training comes through. And we're missing that in a lot of our life, many aspects of our life. One can be a machine operator making tools and be a craftsman just as much as one can be a rug braider or a potter. Those things are not actually antithetical, in my view. One can be a surgeon and be a craftsman. There are many, many ways of looking at craft. What is craft? Trade is using craft, and this is my definition, perhaps it's not everybody's, but trade is when one uses one's craft to make a living. Then one becomes a tradesperson. One is trading. And at that point, if one wants to make a living, one must have quality to sell. And that's where the training comes in. I'm repeating myself a little bit there. But I could go on at some length about standards and such, but maybe we should open the discussion to the floor.
Yeah, I'd like to work a little bit from your talking about training, and because and also what is craftsmanship and how is it differentiated from being a technician or being in a trade or being an artist. I mean, these are all things that interrelate, and you probably can't do any one of those without doing at least one of the others, if not all of the others, in order to be able to really grow as a craftsman. One of the definitions that Richard Sennett in his book gives for craftsmanship, or that craftsmen, part of why they do what they do is to achieve excellence or to achieve high quality, that they get satisfaction out of doing something well, and that's separate from being paid for it. It's separate from other parts of the process. So that one of his definitions of a craftsman is someone who is engaged in producing a quality product for its own sake. But you raised the question of training and how do we get there. And one of the maxims that's gone around, I don't know who to attribute it to, but is the 10,000 hour rule or idea that in order to do anything well, you have to spend 10,000 hours doing it, whether it's becoming a musician, whether it's becoming a painter, that it's just an accumulated amount of time of engagement in the process that leads to, I guess, becoming a master in the process. So that's where we get to. But I'm also interested in the question of where we begin. Actually, I had an interesting conversation with George Steinmeier, who was here yesterday, and we were talking about training. George is an organ maker, trained in Germany, or organ builder, thank you, and served an apprenticeship in Germany, as I also served an apprenticeship in violin making in Germany. How important is it to begin the process from a hands-on standpoint of getting your hands into whatever it is that you're doing, as opposed to starting from a theoretical understanding? Do you have any reaction or any thoughts on that, either from your own experience or what you see as going on around you?
There's a little quote or misquote, perhaps, I'm not sure. What I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember. What I do, I understand. And I like to keep that in mind, because without doing, you can see something, but if you've never experienced doing it, you can't really do it. You can start to and make mistakes. That's where the training begins. You have to make mistakes.
Anybody here make mistakes?
You mean how many have we made today so far?
How much ripping out have I done?
I was always amazed in college to hear about, we were there hands-on learning the steps to blowing glass and practicing it every day. And over in Europe, if you attend a top art school, you go to a glass design class, and you send your designs to a factory, and the factory produces the glass. So you never know the technical hurdles or what it would take to make the piece. You just design it. And and that's a lot of the system in which the things are made. Even in Corning, New York, you have the glass blowers, you have the glass cutters, you have the glass polishers. Everybody has their own task, but no one person could complete a piece entirely on their own. And we were so gifted as students to be able to know every last process. I mean, I can do anything right now out of glass that I could possibly want to, from kiln casting to hot pour to blowing, and it all is there in my hands. I've done it.
It's a bit different with rug making, and because although there are classes and there are rug camps and there's plenty of opportunity to learn how to make it, which I think is really important to take a class. A lot of people look at rug braiding and think it's going to be so easy, and it's kind of, I think they wonder why they're spending 5 days learning how to do what, when you braid your hair all the time. And it's fascinating to see by 12 o'clock on the first day of class, people are kind of overwhelmed. This is a 5-day class, right? So it's very concentrated. And I think the hands-on experience, at least for my craft, is really, it's so crucial. I mean, you can read a book, you can look at a lot of beautiful pictures of rugs that are both for the floor and the wall, and you can admire the artistry in them and the color and various shapes and sizes, but I think until you actually have your hands on the wool and you're actually doing the braiding and realizing that it takes more coordination, you have to train your brain. And so I think starting with training right away after you might see a book or a picture or hear about it like I did and wonder what it was, actually getting your hands on this wool is what, and just practice and getting help from people who teach, and about maybe some techniques that might work better than others, whereas when you got it in school. In this craft, it's mainly if you want to teach, there isn't a certification program, but I think encouraging people to try it is crucial.
And in clay, certainly, the material itself is so tactile, the words don't really get you too far to figure out how to throw a pot. You have to do it. Get your hands in there and mush around and see how it responds, and see how the clay evolves at different levels of dryness, and just in the whole kiln is likewise a really sort of experiential kind of thing. I think that's one of the real attractions that we all have to working really in a basic sort of way with the materials. It's not so much a heady thing. And at the same time, we need a language to describe what we're doing and to teach others to do it and to communicate. But it's primarily physical contact with our medium.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
I'm Ron Demers, and I'm a woodworker up in Halifax. I was, as you were saying about the physicalness of like the learning, woodworking is a very technical thing. If you do something wrong, you're gonna find out soon enough that you did it wrong. And so I guess I have a problem with the disregarding of the written material, because if it weren't for a bunch of woodworkers in the 70s to write down in books everything that they've experienced on their own, like I wouldn't necessarily have access to that information. So when I run into a problem, I know that I can find the solution in some index of some sort. So I think there's a balance between the two.
I think you're right about written directions, and
Speaking of which.
I do give out written directions in classes, and
Do you have a copy of the book?
yeah, and I primarily in the teaching setting, think that most people learn by looking at you do it. But I always say it's important to follow along in the written instructions, so that when you go home and you say, did she say right over center or left over center or whatever, you have a reference that you can look it up and not spend your next week until your next lesson or whatever it is trying to figure it out. So I think I agree with you that, and I use both, and people learn so differently. Some people, can read those directions and get it without a class, certainly. And most of us, though, I think learn best when we have someone who's right there, I've found.
Walter's first point about looking at craftsmanship in the 21st century is the computer, or sort of broadening that to the internet. And I think that's not only going to, or has changed the way in which marketing happens and the way in which craftsmen come in contact with their market, with the people that they're working with. But it also changes the way in which craftsmen come in contact with each other. There is a terrific violin makers dialogue group. That's people are asking questions, getting answers. The access that craftsmen have now and will probably progressively have in the future to other craftsmen to be able to inspire them, to instruct them, is going to be game-changing. I think one of the possible downsides of that, of how much is the quality that we look for in craft a localism. And if we become globalized in our craftsmanship, are we going to lose something? How do we balance that particular issue? I think is going to be one of the challenges in the 21st century.
I'm George Steinmeier. I'm the guy who used to build pipe organs. I went through a training period of many years, and where every step sort of was planned in advance by craftsmen in their specific field. which is pretty broad when you talk about primaries. And in that process, the most important aspect for me was the observation of people who were doing something that I was learning. And they showed me the right way of doing it, and I watched that over and over and over. I could really read that in the book, you know, but I could not put my hands on it, on that thinking. At the same time, I think the book is equally important to give you diversity of what you learn from this one person. Broadens your horizon. And as part of my training, I spent 2 half days for 4 years in school, sitting on a desk and had to work on it, and applied some of these thoughts that I had learned in school on the workbench or whatever it may have been, and connect this together. But to get to a certain standard in what we are doing, you have to see the person who does it as a master. You don't want to learn it from somebody who really only thinks he's a master, but he is not.
I think it's an interesting question, how much what makes, or what the quality in craft is. How much is it the what? Is there something measurably different, or how much is it the how? That there is something in the way in which the craftsmen work that ends up with a qualitative difference that that is somehow important.
I think to some degree that is the observation. Eventually, not on the first day, but eventually you see how, at what speed, with what perfection, my master does something perfectly right. And you know it's right when it fits in 2 parts have to be together. And you know it's right when they are together. Or then if they wobble, then you know it was not a craftsman who did this, it was a beginner. And that begins with the first piece of wood that you work with. And if somebody gives you a handsaw and it tells you to cut a straight cut on a piece of on a board, and you have never done this with a handsaw, it doesn't come out right, you know. The craftsman who has the experience.
I had a saw like that once.
It takes no time, you know. But in order to, and then you look at it, it's straight, and so on, and you see it's right, you know. So then your observation comes back in from a different perspective, that you assess what you see and what you and learn how to recognize things.
You know, to take this in a little bit of a different direction and give some voice to the other side here, you know, the crafts movement, arts and crafts movement really emerged as a reaction to the industrialization of manufacturing. And, you know, when it came to the point where machines could really make stuff that fit together and were predictable in their production, people, some people anyway, lost kind of warmth for the objects being made, and the kind of meaning to them, or just the way that they fit into their lives, became less interesting or meaningful. So as craftspeople, we need to do our work well. We need to know what we're doing and use our materials appropriately and so on. But the coexisting challenge is to really give a human element to this object that we're making, and kind of make it new, not just to reproduce it with perfect skill, but to bring this magic of the human touch and let it be seen, and kind of come up with a new idea, maybe, of, you know, how can we reassemble these concepts or whatever, jam on the theme. So to me, that's particularly exciting in clay. You know, we have our classical objects that we make, but then there's always a challenge of how do you make, you know, your mug or your bowl or a teapot or whatever a little bit differently than the next person. And it's a really wonderful opportunity to enter in and just work on design and developing a signature sort of style. And that's where the real excitement and warmth is for me.
You want to build on that?
I'm Steve Lloyd. I'm a member of Brattleboro West Arts. I'm a painter and an architect. And I'm familiar with Walter's work, and I think it would be interesting to bring it forward again. If you could bring the teapot forward, because what it seems to show to me is this tradition. You talk about, you know, a traditional form that comes from Japan. And I assume that's kind of the vessel itself. And then there's this handle, which I would be surprised if in traditional Japanese work a handle will look like that. That seems to me to be something that you've introduced into this traditional equation, and that's what brings it for me into the 21st century. And then these cups that you have in back, which so beautifully fit the hand, you know, the way your fingers go into those grooves. And, you know, if you could just talk about the fact that, you know, it's harder to make that than to make the smooth-sided thing. I think that's really interesting, and to me it makes it a whole new element that hasn't existed before.
Right. When I'm quite excited about these little cups that take me very small amount of time to produce. I can actually make them very quickly. But but I think a person would react immediately to say a machine did not make this, and each one I make is different, and it kind of shows the gesture of the movement, kind of the wheel and the throwing. It's not sort of symmetrical and reproducible in that way. Interestingly, though, you know, there are elements of this ethic, the Japanese notion of beauty and so on, that really are consistent with the handle. You know, there's a way in which, in that tradition, natural objects are really revered and worshipped, and the imperfections, seeming imperfections, are actually celebrated. So it's not in a classic Japanese tradition at all, but for me it's the same gesture, it's the same impulse, and I get a kick out of it.
And personal innovation, but something else that goes into it, I think, is time, speed. A beginner cannot make, I'm a woodworker, cannot make a dovetail joint in moments. It takes a lot of effort, and I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about, George.
If he makes it.
If he makes it, that's right. I did for many tries. But now I have done 10,000 dovetails, or some god-awful number, and I can practically do it in my sleep. It is not that hard for me. And so the speed and the effort that goes into it is another part of that quality. It's just the same as maybe after I had done 15, and I could do them well. They worked. They didn't wobble. But I sure don't have to think about it anymore. And that's another part of quality that's not something you can measure, except for perhaps the price. Because it doesn't take me as long to make it. The price is less. Maybe it should be more. I don't.
What's up? An amplifier.
So, say a little bit about what you do.
I have a company that builds wooden boats, wooden canoes and boats, and it's a very interesting point that he's just made. I think it's one of the most fascinating things. You talked a little bit earlier about from head to hand. I actually think it's from head to heart. The hand is going to do it. At some point, the head is controlling the hand, and at some point, as you go forward, the heart controls the hand. And you're doing this. Maybe repetitive thing or this creative thing, but it comes to a point where you do it without thinking about it. You know, and it may be the 10,000th joint, it may be the 10,000th nail that you put into a plank, or it may be the 10,000th time you plane something. I couldn't tell you if it's 10,000, but I watch this a lot with boat builders. Boats have nothing straight in them. You know, there's no straight lines, there's no using squares and marking it off and cutting it. It's all moving, it's all bending all the time. And we might have a new planker join the company, and he'll start off and he'll make a mess of it and then a mess of it, and he'll never get it right, and he'll turn around and say, I don't think I can ever do this. And at some point, it might be 1 year, it might be 2 years, it might be 5 years, or maybe never, actually. They make the transition where suddenly they're doing it without thinking. And the work at that point is, let's not say perfect, but it's wonderful. And they can do it and continue a conversation with you. You know, what were you doing on the weekend? And they're still working away and the plank's going perfectly. And you go, how do you do that? You know, how could you possibly get to that point in your craft where you're no longer using your mind to tell your hands what to do? Your hands already know what they're doing. And I think that is, to me, one of the fascinating sort of transitions that occurs when people kind of go over. I don't want to say, it's not even a hump. You know, it goes from craft to art or head to heart. You know.
It's one of the things that where Richard Sennett and his interest in craftsmanship comes around, that it's not just about preserving craftsmanship, but it's about maintaining a livable human culture, and that without having this kind of experience within our communities, that we're going to have a technical community but not one with heart. I like your putting that in there, and also responding to the world intuitively and not just intellectually. Is that something that how important is that for our life as a community, and how important is that going to be during the 21st century? And what is the role of crafts and craftsmen in maintaining that, if it is important? I'd like to throw that direction out there.
I would just like to add two more things. Number one is that one has to take on responsibility. If you make something for somebody else, you have to be responsible for the quality that you create. And you have that, you either have it or you don't have it, or you acquire it. But the novice who starts out doesn't know what that quality is. He has to be taught. And eventually, when he has been taught and has acquired it after 10,000 tries, he's very proud that whatever he does, it works. You know? So it's a process. It's not something that happens overnight or by reading a book or saying, oh, that's good enough. For these guys, it's never good enough.
The European guild system,
Exactly,
where
exactly.
that you're an apprentice, you're a journeyman, and it's when you're a master that you're allowed to have your own business, where you are taking responsibility for the product. But the guild ensures that that when you take responsibility, there is this wealth of experience and training there in order to preserve the integrity of the product that the guild stands behind.
And the guild, in a sense, creates the standard. We were talking briefly a moment about something like the standard, what is good and what is bad. The guild in those days did set the standards in many ways.
There's another question over this way.
I just wanted any, yes.
I was just going to call attention to places like Berea College in Kentucky. It's not only about going there with the intention of learning a craft, but each student is responsible for learning a skill that becomes a craft for their shop that supports their own tuition and the community as a whole, which is the school. And they have academics and all of the other things too. But what I observed there and what I hear all of you talking about, first, we're assuming tonight that you came with an assumption that, oh, I would really love to learn to work in wood. And sometimes a student doesn't know that. And I'm thinking about the Putney School level at this point. You know, they offer this diverse arts program, and some of the schools do, some of them don't. I, for one, have been the art teacher in public schools. It can be painful. But at the same time, if I just introduce one child at that time to an interest, which is how you discovered rug making or rug making, that to me is a very important part of the 21st century, because we've become so technological and so mechanized, and that there's also a new genre. You may learn to jog, and that makes you feel better after you've sat for 9 hours at your job. Also, if you can learn a skill with your hands that becomes part of your heart, that's an enrichment in life. And I think you bring that home with you then. And that as a whole can be nurtured. And it enriches your life, but it will enrich the lives around you as well. So maybe the 21st century needs to also think about bringing that back. At one point in my life, I managed a company of 13 potters. And what I learned was that I would get an order from some place like Houston, and they would just think we could just whip some more of those out. And I finally said to them, you need to come to New York, and you need to see my studio, and you need to see these 13 Bennington grads at $1.25 an hour or something like that. Something horrible, some horrible amount of money working, and then you'll know what this is about. But when they would come, they wouldn't necessarily be craftspeople. What I learned was that as I'm taking them on the little tour, if I hand them a ball of clay, suddenly they're in contact with this material that they know nothing about. But that, how you, part of your marketing is not just your new websites, but putting that craft in the hands of the market that you're trying to address. And I think that's important to address.
This is back to Marta's point about educating the public.
Well, and I can also touch, I do a lot of teaching adult bead classes, and I get a lot of people who are in high-stress jobs who come to me to make beads, which is sometimes a very stressful thing for people to make glass that cracks and pops at you. And they come to unwind with me. And I also have family members who have accounting jobs where they sit behind desks, and they go home and they throw pots. And they need the craft to enrich their lives, because the office is so mundane. It's such a cold environment for them. And so to be creative at home is and that may be it. It may become hobbies, and then the hobbies become passions, and then the passions become a career.
Well, it's one path.
Yeah. But it for some people it takes over. And in the glass world, we actually have a lot of physicians who've turned over, and a lot of potters who've turned over to glass. And it's great how it all sort of can start running into each other and become something new.
I think on your point of the importance of everyone having the experience of working with a material and exploring it, I'm wondering whether any of the Putney School students have any observation on what it's like to be at a school where you have to do hands-on things. We seem to think that enriches your lives. Do you feel that? Anyone?
It definitely does.
Excuse me?
It definitely does, I think.
Can you, what activities have you been involved with?
Ceramics. And I don't know, I guess not just the fact that you're making something, but the fact that you're learning about something you know nothing about.
And what are your observations about other students that you're working with, and what their experiences of it are?
I don't know, I guess more in ceramics, since it's more you and the clay, it's different. But I don't know. It's definitely an enriching experience.
Any other Putney student want to?
My only glass student who actually came to my studio tour and made a bead is not here tonight. but she came and she made a bead, so she knows like what hot glass is, the experience of hot glass is.
Hi, I'm James Wallace. I'm music director at Putney School. And arts department chair. I forgot about that. I try to forget about that. Talk about herding cats. But I wanted to say that since we're talking about the 21st century, and the implication is how do we look to the future, that, you know, obviously there, on some level, a lot of people think of craftsmanship as nostalgic or quaint or the way we used to do things. And that is, I mean, lucky for us, there are people like you who have refused to look at it that way and look at it instead as, no, this is the human way to do things. This is the real way to do things. Because we live in a time when, I mean, who could have imagined 40 years ago that acres and acres and acres of Detroit would be used to grow food, right? We could not have imagined that that would happen in our lifetimes, but it is happening right now. And so the local side of this and the hands-on part of it, I think, is going to be really increasingly important in our society, not less important. When I was a kid, there was no such thing as a high school in the United States that didn't have industrial arts or some kind of hands-on work. And a lot of that sort of faded away with budget crises and also the thought that somehow we're all going to live virtual lives. And so it's a really fascinating time to be in education and to try to be advocating for real hands-on work for students, and that it is not true that somehow we're all going to become bodiless spirits and will be able to exist on the web without having to do anything physical. And that's kind of been the thrust of the American education policy for decades, and I think it's changing, which is really exciting to see. So keep doing what you're doing, because we need you. As the culture changes and people, I think, see the shallowness of what we've created and are looking for meaning, they're going to be increasingly, I hope, turning to craftsmanship as a way of expressing themselves.
The Green Mountain Rug Hooking Guild, which actually is located in Vermont, but it's a national organization. One of our missions is to spread the word about rug hooking, and so we have education kits that people donate, wool strips, which is what you use in hooking, and hoops and a hook, and most people have scissors. And it comes as a kit in a school or a senior center. You know, anyone can. It's, you know, it's just based on interest, and it's free, and you can order these kits, and then someone has to, you know, teach, and it's mainly in schools. But I think it's so important to kind of expose younger people to these wonderful crafts. And this is pretty portable, so it's easy to do in that situation, whereas woodworking or something, or, you know, you don't have a kiln maybe in school, but really it is our responsibility, I think, to not only be teaching it and some retail, selling our work, and that is good also, but I do think we have a responsibility to kind of pass the skills that we learned from someone else who passed it to us, and we're passing it to the next generations. And that's a really good feeling, I think, for all of us in whatever it is we love to do.
I'd like to take a bit of a stretch here, maybe, and speak to this as a physician. There are some. I mean, I'm excited about the opportunities that the internet and digital technology offers, and I think we need to embrace those and be aware of them. There are, however, a big downside, or at least a significant downside, to the digital world. Sitting in front of a screen for a long period of time, not having your hands on material, having things change quickly in front of your eyes, not having to concentrate on making something just taking a long time to make it to work it out. There's a way in which you get sort of instant feedback and you're on to the next thing. It doesn't engage our sort of attention in a sense, in a human way. And people are developing whatever disorders because of this technology, whether it's an actual internet addiction or attention deficit disorder or just like a major disconnect to the real world. So for me, it's great to like have my hands in mud and and put the wood into the fire and just like see how the world works and how how long it takes to make a pot or to dry a pot or to whatever. These physical processes, I think we have an evolutionary kind of connection to a certain pace of work. There's kind of a healthy way that humans function, and to some degree that's not in sync with some of what digital technology offers. So it's a human kind of scale, a human sort of experience, and I think we're wired, to do this kind of work in these sort of ways, and also to just the physical objects themselves. I think that are produced can have a greater resonance and depth and just sort of natural reference, which I think is healthy as well.
I'm Naomi Lindenfeld, a ceramics teacher at the Putney School and a potter and a member of Brattleboro West Arts. And I wanted to engage the students a little bit more since there are a lot of you here. I wonder if any of you want to say anything about the satisfaction that you had of making something yourself. Something about that experience of making things with your hands.
They've never been this quiet.
Yeah, producing something and being proud of it is probably one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done. I went to a public school before going to Putney, and we didn't have art classes. So being able to come to Putney, which is basically the polar opposite of where I originally went, and being able to not only have academic classes, but to create these things that you get to use and keep and show to people, it's really satisfying. Yeah.
Anyone else? Or about the process of working really hard at learning a skill and then a breakthrough of actually having it turn into something that can then be kept and used. Any of you had that experience of that kind of struggling with a material, with clay, and then all of a sudden having something come to fruition and that would be something that you can imagine using in your life.
I'm Carol Schnabel, and I'm a weaver, and the school part of it, what I wanted to add was I've been doing artist in residence programs in schools from little kids, well I teach adults too, but not in schools, for over 30 years, and I think one of the things that I always find remarkable, and often the teachers in the classroom find remarkable, is there are plenty of kids who don't respond well to our cookie cutter style of learning and teaching, and so I come in as this special event for a week or however long, and there are usually in every group there's some kids who well there's always kids who do well and their teachers would have expected them to do well, but there's usually kids who are not academically inclined, who just really respond positively to weaving, and they just take right off with it and they excel, and I just it kind of breaks my heart when I leave because I know that they have so few opportunities in their entire education to learn that way. And I think so many of us are wired to learn with our hands, and that, you know, I started doing it in the late 70s, early 80s, and there was a lot more money in those days for arts and education. And now the school systems are set up really different, and even if there is money, the teachers usually don't even have time because they are so constricted in a way they didn't used to be. And so we're getting less and less of that, and I really feel the need for it when I go into the classrooms. I really feel like there's everybody's craving it.
So that brings up a question for me that I've had for a long time, which is what models can we use or invent for a new way of educating those students who don't fit into the cookie cutter mold, for whom our education system, our public education system as we now know it, does not serve their needs, does not serve the needs of society. Can we help those kids, those people, with a very different model based on craft and based on honoring craft for a change? It's honorable work, as we've been talking about, yet it has been discredited in American society for 50, 100 years. It's time to start honoring it again, and that means teaching it. What models are there? George came up in a very different, and Doug, you went through the same sort of apprenticeship program. Is that a possible way to educate our citizens?
I'd actually like to speak to that for a moment.
So,
Okay. All I'll
go
say
ahead.
is that the Europeans are living in the same modern world that we have, but what they've not done is abandoned technical education at the high school level. And in Europe, in Germany, in Scandinavia, there are still business high schools, there are technical high schools, and everyone just thinks, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. There isn't the American sense of judgment of going to college or not going to college. And I think that has been a real stumbling block for us because we set it up as a symbol of progress, and now we're afraid to let it erode even a little bit in order to say there's value in other things.
George, do you want to?
Well, I wanted to say something else, but I can only confirm what you just said. German education is on a much broader base, on different levels. That you can go to a trade school, so to speak, if I may say that, versus an academic-oriented place. But you can go around that way and later on do your academic stuff later. And that's one thing. But I want to say one thing about the craftsmen which I have met in my few years of life. I don't remember any single middle-aged or elder craftsman who was not happy. These people were all extremely satisfied with their life. They were very realistic, proud, responsible, and I think those are traits which sometimes get lost in education. So I think when some of these people that we don't really see in the public, but who do their work as craftsmen with leather or rock making or what it may be, are very solid citizens with goals and with expectations, responsibilities, and they're happy. With that, I'm done for today.
Well, this actually sounds like a pretty good recipe for the 21st century. That what are the things that we need? We need to be happy. We need to be healthy. We need to be connected to our community, and these all seem to be things that arise naturally out of craftsmanship. Naomi, did you?
Well, I just wanted to add that even if someone doesn't do a craft as a trade, as a profession, that having it as part of your life, or being a student and taking a class in craft, it probably affects your experience with all your academic work, to bring a balance to it and bring use a different part of your brain, and it may then bring your energy back to your academic work in a different way than if you didn't have that as part of your life. Or for someone who has a profession but does craft as a hobby or something that they love to do, it brings a different kind of balance to our lives.
I think it's a real fullness,
Mm-hmm.
That's there every day. And I drive around and I look at things in nature and, in storefronts or used items or people, and it all gets me thinking about, wow, I could make that into something. And it's just present all the time. And one thing I just want to say, in thinking about how to get some of this back in the schools, one thing Brattleboro does is they have an after-school program. There's a little more time in that program I know that they're looking for volunteers, and there are opportunities there. It's not a long period of time, but it is a way in.
Thank you all. Brattleboro community of craftspeople and
being so supportive.
We appreciate it very much.